For as long as you have kept a garden, you have spent your summers at war with it. The weeding that grows back the week after you finish it. The watering that never seems to be enough in July. The dusting and the spraying for whatever is chewing the beans this year. The bare, baked ground between your rows that turns hard as a county road by August. You have done that work faithfully, season after season, on knees that don't bend quite the way they used to. And I want to tell you something it took me most of my life to understand. Almost none of it was ever your fault. Every one of those battles, the weeds, the thirst, the bugs, the crust, traces back to a single decision. A decision most of us made without ever knowing we were making it. We left the ground bare. For 450 million years, plants have grown on this earth. And in all that time, in every forest and prairie and meadow, nature has never once fought the battles you fight every summer. Not because nature is lucky, because nature never leaves its soil naked, not for a season, not for a week, not anywhere, except one place, the vegetable garden. The one patch of ground on the whole planet where we deliberately strip the cover off the soil and call it good management. Clean rows, tidy beds, bare dirt, proudly kept. Today I want to hand you the other way. The way the forest and the old-timers have always known. A way of gardening where the ground itself does the weeding, holds the water, feeds the plants, and keeps the pests guessing. So you can finally set the hoe down for good. They call it living mulch. And by the time we're done here, I don't think you will ever look at a bare row the same way again. Let me start with a little test you can do this very afternoon. Walk to the nearest patch of woods and kneel down. Push the leaves aside on the forest floor and feel the soil underneath. It is cool. It is damp. It is dark and crumbly, and it smells alive. Because it is. Nobody waters it. Nobody weeds it. Nobody has fed it in 10,000 years. And it is some of the richest ground on earth. Now go home and lay your hand on the bare soil between your tomatoes on a hot afternoon. It is dry. It is pale. The top has sealed over into a crust. And if you slid a thermometer just under that surface on a bright July day, it could read past 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to cook the life clean out of the top inch of your soil. The very inch where nearly all the good biology lives. That is the whole difference between covered ground and naked ground. And every trouble you fight in summer grows straight out of it. Bare soil loses its moisture to the sun several times faster than covered soil. Researchers have measured a good mulch cutting that surface loss by close to half. That is half of your watering going up into the air before your plants ever get a sip of it. Bare soil bakes. Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott, the horticulturist at Washington State University who has spent her whole career testing garden claims against the actual evidence, has shown that simply covering the ground can drop the soil temperature by more than 10 degrees Celsius in the heat of summer. Your roots feel that difference. Your earthworms feel it even more. Bare soil grows weeds, because most weed seeds need a flash of light to wake up, and open ground is nothing but an engraved invitation. Bare soil crusts over, so the next rain runs off the top instead of soaking in. And bare soil is a billboard for pests who spot your plants easily when they sit there alone against a background of naked dirt with nothing to hide behind. Now here is the part worth sitting with a moment. Every single one of those problems has a product on a shelf to solve it. Irrigation for the water you're losing. Weed cloth and weed killer for the weeds. Bagged fertilizer for the ground that has gone too dead to feed itself. A whole industry built on the consequences of one habit, the bare row. That nature never once endorsed. I am not going to sit here and tell you somebody is hiding this from you. Nobody buried it in a vault. The truth is simpler and honestly a little sadder than any conspiracy. You cannot patent a plant that sows itself. You cannot bottle living roots. And you certainly cannot sell a gardener the same handful of clover seed every spring because good living mulch comes back on its own. A thing that costs almost nothing and asks almost nothing after the first year is the one thing an industry built on the next bag has no reason to keep reminding you about. So it quietly slipped out of the seed catalogs and out of our habits in about 2 generations. That's all. Not stolen. Just allowed to be forgotten. Your grandparents very likely knew it. The old Victory Garden booklets talked about it plainly. The market gardeners who fed whole towns lived by it. So let me hand it back to you now. One piece at a time, sorted not by fancy names, but by the plain job each one does in your garden. The first job, and the beating heart of this whole system, is the living floor you grow underneath everything else. And the plant that does it best is one you already know by sight: Dutch white clover. You have seen it your whole life. In lawns, along paths, that low green carpet with the little white flowers the honeybees adore. Most folks spend good money trying to poison it out of existence. I am going to ask you to do the exact opposite, because white clover, grown on purpose beneath your vegetables, may be the hardest working plant you will ever choose not to harvest. Here is why it works. White clover stays low, under 6 or 8 inches, and it creeps sideways, rooting down everywhere it touches, until it knits your whole bed into one dense green mat. And that mat is doing 6 jobs at the very same time. It shades the soil cool. It holds the moisture in. It smothers weeds before they can start. It feeds the bees and the good bugs with its flowers. It keeps living roots in the ground all season long. And this is the quiet miracle. It makes its own nitrogen straight out of the air. Clover is a legume. Down on its roots, in tiny pink nodules, it partners with a bacterium that pulls nitrogen right out of the air in the soil and turns it into plant food. A healthy stand of white clover can fix somewhere between 70 and 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre in a single year. And the university trials often measure a good deal more than that. That is fertilizer your garden quietly manufactures for itself, for free, while you sleep. Now, how do you actually use it? You sow it thin, right in and among your beds, and you let it fill in beneath your tomatoes, your peppers, your squash, your greens. Your tall crops stand well above it and never even notice it's there. When it gets shaggy, you shear it or mow it back, and within a few days, it's growing again, good as new. And here is the honest part, the part the slick videos always skip. Some of the best proof that this works comes from the University of Georgia. Dr. Nick Hill and his colleagues grew a living mulch of white clover under field corn for 4 straight years, and they published exactly what they found. The soil under that clover got better faster than the soil under ordinary once-a-year cover crops. It drained better, it held water better, it packed down less. The ground was measurably healthier, and it got there quicker. But that same study found something else, and I am going to tell you plainly, because you have earned the whole truth from me. In that trial, the corn yield went down. The clover, growing right in there among the corn, competed with it for a share of the water and the food. That is the catch that nobody ever mentions. Living mulch is not magic. It is a living thing. And living things compete. So let me give you what those researchers, out on a big field with a tractor, could not easily do. But what you, in your own garden beds, absolutely can. 3 simple ways to keep the clover working for you, and never against you. First, keep it mowed low around your main crops, so it stays a floor and never grows into a rival. Second, give your vegetables a running head start. Set them in as strong young transplants, tall enough to reach the light over the clover from the very first day, instead of tiny seeds fighting it down at ground level. And third, when you plant, just pull the clover back a hand's width from each stem, so every plant gets its own little clearing to settle into. Do those 3 small things, and you get all of it. The covered, cooled, fed, living soil, without ever paying for it at harvest. You get the good half of that Georgia study, and you leave the bad half out on the research farm where it belongs. Now, everything I'm walking you through. Which cover crop for which job, exactly when to sow each one, and an honest, plain-spoken year-by-year of what to expect. I have gathered onto a single page you can print out and tape right inside your shed door. When the little square code comes up on your screen, just point your phone's camera at it, and that page is yours to keep. No charge. Nothing to sign up for. Think of it as a neighbor folding a note and passing it across the fence. Then stay right here with me, because the next piece is how you keep that soil covered straight through the winter, through the 4 long, cold months when nearly every other garden in the country lies naked and freezing and washing away in the rain. White clover is a wonder from spring clear through fall. But when the hard cold comes, in most of the country, it lies down to sleep. Its leaves brown off, and though the roots hang on underground, the surface can sit half bare from about November all the way to March. That's 4 months of naked ground. Right when the winter rains are pounding it flat and rinsing your hard-won nitrogen down below the roots, where no plant can ever reach it again. So we cover that cold gap with 2 more plants that actually love the winter, and they make a perfectly matched pair. The first is crimson clover. Now, don't go confusing it with the little white clover in the lawn. Crimson clover is a showstopper. It throws up deep, Blood-red flower spikes in the spring so striking that some folks grow it just to stand and look at it. You sow it in the early fall, right over your cleared beds or right into the thinning white clover, and it grows quietly all through the cool months, holding the soil and fixing its own nitrogen the entire time. But the real gift of crimson clover is hidden in the timing of those red flowers. They open in early spring, weeks before almost anything else is blooming, and weeks before the first pests of the year have even woken up, and they are absolutely loaded with nectar. So the hoverflies, the lady beetles, the tiny pirate bugs, all the little hunters that eat aphids and caterpillars for a living, they find those flowers, and they move in, and they raise their young right there in your garden. Think about what that means. By the time the first aphid hatches on your tomatoes in May, its predators are already living in the neighborhood, already fed, already breeding, already on patrol. You will have hired your garden's guard force weeks before the trouble ever shows up at the gate. There is not a bottle of anything on any shelf that does that for you. The second plant is winter rye, and I mean the grain. Cereal rye. Not the lawn grass with a similar name. Where the clovers make nitrogen, rye catches it. Rye drives down a huge, dense, thirsty mat of roots that grabs any loose nitrogen still floating in your soil and holds onto it tight all winter, so the rains can't wash it away. Then in spring, when you cut the rye down, it slowly hands all of that nitrogen back to the bed, right where your next crop is reaching for it. And rye has one more trick up its sleeve. As its roots grow, and as its cut stalks break down on the surface, they give off natural compounds that quietly keep weed seeds from sprouting. Researchers have measured rye cutting the following season's broadleaf weeds by half, and in some trials, by a great deal more than half. It is one of the finest natural weed blankets we have ever found. Here is how you use the pair, and here is the one mistake to steer around. In early fall, as each summer crop finishes and comes out, don't let that bed sit empty even a single week. Scatter crimson clover, or rye, or a handful of both, right over the surface. Don't even bother pulling the old roots first. Rake it in lightly, water it once, and walk away. Come spring, cut it all down low and let it fall right where it lands, into a soft mat. But now, here's the mistake. Do not rush out and sow tiny seeds, carrots, lettuce, little things, straight into freshly cut rye. Those same weed-stopping compounds will slow your own small seeds down right along with the weeds. And freshly cut clover can bring a brief flush of soil fungi that nips at tender seedlings. So wait 2 to 3 weeks after you cut. And better still, set in sturdy transplants. Your tomatoes, your peppers, your strong seedlings, which just shrug the whole thing off. Wait a little, plant strong, and that rye becomes the finest free weed control in your whole garden. And understand, this is about so much more than just the nitrogen. That winter cover is a blanket, in the truest sense of the word. It shields your soil from the pounding of the cold rains. It softens the brutal freeze and thaw that heaves and cracks open ground. And it keeps the tiny living things in the top few inches from being killed off by the cold. A covered bed goes into winter tucked in warm. A bare bed goes into winter exposed. And it comes out in spring a little more worn down, a little more washed away, every single year that passes. Now, every gardener alive knows this next moment. It's the middle of July. You pull out the spent peas or the lettuce that bolted in the heat, and all at once there's a bare, sun-blasted hole sitting in the middle of your bed. The clover creeping in from the edges will take weeks to close it. And in the meantime, the weeds move in fast and stake their claim. For that exact moment, there is one plant that has no equal on this earth: buckwheat. Buckwheat is the single fastest cover you can grow. Sow it on warm soil and it is up out of the ground in 3 or 4 days. It shades the whole surface within 2 weeks, and it bursts into a haze of little white flowers in about a month. Flowers that pull in more bees and beneficial insects per square foot than almost anything else you could plant. From bare dirt to full bloom in roughly 5 weeks. Nothing else even comes close to that pace. And underground, buckwheat does something that will genuinely surprise you. It is a phosphorus miner. Phosphorus is one of the big 3 plant foods, and a great deal of it in your soil is locked up in mineral forms your vegetables simply cannot get at. Buckwheat's roots release gentle acids that unlock that phosphorus, pull it up into the plant, and then, when you cut the buckwheat down and let it rot on the bed, hand it right back to your next crop in a form they can finally use. The trials rank buckwheat as roughly 3 times better at scavenging phosphorus than barley, and around 10 times better than rye. So think about what you're really doing here. You are growing a plant that mines fertilizer you already paid for years ago. Fertilizer already sitting in your soil, that your crops could never quite reach on their own. The one and only mistake with buckwheat is a simple one to avoid. Do not let it go to seed, or you'll have volunteer buckwheat popping up everywhere next year. The moment it comes into full flower, mow it down. You keep every bit of the benefit, and you take on none of the nuisance. There is one more strip of ground we haven't covered yet, and it's the one most folks never think of at all: the paths. The places you actually walk, between the beds, along the edges. Bare, packed, weedy walkways are their own small daily misery, and planting grass in a path just buys you more mowing. For those, my very favorite living mulch is creeping thyme. It is a tough little evergreen herb that hugs the ground under 3 inches tall, forms a dense mat that chokes the weeds right out, takes a fair amount of foot traffic, and in early summer covers itself in tiny purple flowers that the pollinators can't resist. You plant it once along your paths and your borders, and after a single season it settles in and simply stays. No mowing, no replanting. Nothing but a fragrant carpet that releases a soft, clean, herbal scent every time you brush past it on your way to the beans. Now, you will hear it said that thyme's scent drives the pests clean away. And here, I want to be honest with you, the way I'd be with a friend over the fence. That aromatic oil does seem to help mask your plants from certain pests, and thyme is genuinely wonderful for drawing in the good bugs. But the plain truth is, the evidence for it truly repelling pests is thin, and I would far rather tell you that straight than sell you a pretty story. So grow creeping thyme for the weed-free, fragrant, pollinator-loved paths it gives you. Whatever it does against pests on top of that is a welcome little bonus. Not a promise I'd ask you to bank on. Now, I've given you the 5 workhorses. White clover for the floor, crimson clover and rye for the winter, buckwheat for emergencies, thyme for the paths. For most gardeners in most of the country, that's the whole toolkit right there. But gardens aren't all the same, and neither are gardeners. So let me hand you 3 more, quietly, for those of you in the harder corners of the map. If you garden in the deep south, where the summer heat turns brutal, you already know white clover can sulk and brown out in July and August, right when you need it most. Your summer partner is the cow pea, the old southern field pea your grandmother grew. It laughs at heat, it fixes nitrogen like the clovers do, and it covers hot ground when nothing else will hold. Let the peas do your summer while the clover rests. If you garden up north, where the winters bite hard and crimson clover can freeze out on you, reach for hairy vetch instead. It is the toughest of the cold season legumes. It survives a real winter, and it fixes a tremendous amount of nitrogen come spring. It's a little more sprawling, so give it something like rye to climb on, and cut it before it sets seed. And if you want a living floor that practically plants itself, look up subterranean clover. It stays flatter than white clover, tucks its seed down near the soil, and reseeds itself so faithfully that once you've got it going, it just keeps coming back on its own, year after year, asking nothing of you. 3 more tools. Pick the ones that fit your own weather. The principle never changes. Keep something living over that soil in every season your climate throws at you. Now, I can just about hear the question forming, because it is the very one every practical gardener asks me next. That's all fine, you're thinking. But how on earth do I get rid of the stuff when I actually need the bed back? You don't own a tractor. You've no wish to be out there wrestling a rototiller at your age. And here is the beautiful part, the part that ought to make you smile. Killing a cover crop by hand is easier than growing one. The old way was to plow it all under and churn the soil to powder. Forget that. We are going to do it the way the no-dig gardeners do it. Right there on the surface, with almost no effort at all. You have 3 gentle tools for the job, and you already own every one of them. The first is simply cutting it down, when your cover crop reaches full flower. And that is the exact moment it has given just about all it is going to give you. You take a string trimmer, or a pair of hand shears, or even just a sharp hoe held out flat, and you cut it off right down at the ground. Then you leave every last scrap of it lying right there where it fell. That cut greenery becomes your mulch. It settles into a soft mat. It shades the soil. It holds the moisture in, and it slowly rots down and feeds the very ground it grew up out of. You chop it, and you drop it. That is the entire method. The second tool, for the low creeping clovers, is easier still. You simply walk it down, or roll something heavy across it and crimp the stems flat. Bent and crushed while they're in flower, they lie right down and give up, and you never cut a thing. And the third, for a truly stubborn patch, is to lay a sheet of plain cardboard or an old tarp right over the top of it for a couple of weeks. No light gets in, and the cover quietly surrenders underneath, leaving you soft, dark, ready ground behind. Whichever way you choose, notice what you never did. You never once turned that soil over. You never disturbed the fungal web living in it. And you never, ever broke your back. You cut, you cover, and you plant. That, right there, is the whole gentle art of it. So far, everything I've shown you happens up where you can see it. But the deepest reason this whole thing works happens down in the dark, where you can't. Underneath a healthy garden runs a web of fungus. Fine white threads, thinner than a strand of sewing thread, spreading out through the soil and joining right onto the roots of your plants. Gardeners call it the mycorrhizal network, and it acts like a second, far larger root system, reaching into pockets of soil your plant's own roots could never touch, and trading water and minerals back to them in exchange for just a little sugar. Here is the crucial thing about that fungal web. It only stays alive as long as there are living roots to feed it. In an ordinary garden, when the last crop is pulled in the fall and the ground goes bare, those roots die. And within days, the living network starves and comes apart. Then comes spring. Every new seedling you set out has to sit and wait weeks for that web to slowly rebuild itself from scratch. And those, my friend, are exactly the weeks your transplants stand there, looking pale and sulky and seeming to beg for fertilizer. But in a garden that is never bare, where clover roots are alive down there all year round, that network never dies in the first place. It's alive, and it's waiting. So when you set a tomato into living mulched ground, its roots plug straight into that web in a matter of days, not weeks. It comes online at full speed from day one. That, all by itself, is why gardeners with an established living mulch will swear up and down that their transplants just take off. Now let me be as honest with you about this as I've tried to be about everything else. You will hear some folks tell it that the clover feeds nitrogen straight into your tomato through this fungal highway, in real time, like water running through a pipe. And the truth is genuinely exciting. But it is also still being worked out by better minds than mine. Scientists have measured nitrogen from legumes making its way over to their neighbors. That part is real and settled. What they are still honestly arguing about is exactly how and how much, and whether it travels through the fungal threads directly or just moves through the soil around them. So here is the version I can stand behind completely. Keep living roots in your ground the whole year around, and you keep that underground network alive and working on your behalf. That much is solid, and honestly, that much is plenty. The rest, we are all still learning together. And any gardener who tells you they've got the whole thing perfectly figured out is a gardener to trust just a little less, not a little more. And that fungus is only half of the crew working down there for you. The other half, you can actually hold right in your hand. The earthworms. A covered, fed, undisturbed bed is pure paradise to a worm. They rise up by the thousands to feed on that decaying clover and mulch, and every last one of them is a tiny plow that never once cuts a root. Tunneling, opening the soil to air and water, and leaving behind castings that are among the richest natural fertilizers on this whole earth. In a bare, tilled garden, the worms are few and far between. In a living mulched one, you'll turn a trowel and find the soil fairly crawling with them. That is not a pest, friend. That is the sound of your garden quietly growing rich. Let me set your expectations honestly now, because a real change in your soil takes a little patience. And I would far rather you know that walking in than have you give up on it in month 2. The first year is the learning year. You are getting the clover established and learning the rhythm of when to sow each cover. The soil is only just beginning to turn. You will still weed. You will still water. Do not let that discourage you for 1 minute. You are laying the track that everything else will run on. By the second year, the clover is thicker and surer. You'll start noticing more worms every time you turn a trowel. The soil is a shade darker in your hand, and one ordinary afternoon, it simply dawns on you that you are watering less and weeding a good deal less than you used to. By the third year, the system is just running. The clover feeds the beds. The worms have spread their castings through every inch of it. You reach down for a handful of soil, and it comes up dark and crumbly and cool, and it smells sweet and alive. And it settles over you, with a quiet kind of wonder, that you haven't bought a bag of fertilizer in 2 years. You haven't sprayed a thing. Your watering is cut in half, and your weeding has gone from long hours down to a few easy minutes. That is exactly what the title promised you at the start: soil that feeds itself. And it is real. It is simply honest about the clock. 2 or 3 seasons, and a little tending along the way. Not a miracle poured out of a bag. A partnership. One that grows stronger every single year you keep it up. And if any of this still feels new or untried to you, let me set your mind at ease. Because it is actually very, very old. Back in the 1950s, a plain-spoken woman named Ruth Stout scandalized the whole gardening world by flatly refusing to plow, or dig, or weed her garden at all. She just kept it buried under a thick, permanent blanket of mulch the year around, and she grew her vegetables clear into her 90s with almost no labor to speak of. They took to calling her the no-work garden lady. And more recently, an Englishman named Charles Dowding has spent decades carefully proving it, bed by patient bed. That soil left undug and kept covered will outgrow the dug and the bare kind, season after season. So this is no fad, my friend. You would simply be stepping into a long, stubborn, sensible line of gardeners who worked out, the slow way, that the soil does far better when we fuss at it less. And please, hear me on this last practical thing. Do not go out this weekend and try to convert the whole garden at once. That, right there, is how good ideas get abandoned by 4th of July. Start with one bed, just one. This fall, when a single bed comes empty, scatter a little crimson clover or rye across it and rake it in. Next spring, sow 1 packet of white clover under one crop you're already growing anyway. That is the entire beginning. It'll cost you a few dollars in seed and about 10 minutes of your time. It's forgiving. It's completely reversible. And by this time next year, that one little bed will have taught you more than I ever could. Because let's be honest with each other. You have grown food for more years than most people on this earth ever will. This was never me teaching you how to garden. This is just one old, honest idea, handed back to you across the fence. The very one the catalogs quietly talked us all out of, somewhere along the way. I told you, right at the start, that you've spent your summers at war with your garden, pulling and hauling and spraying and fighting ground that seemed dead set on drying out and crusting over and growing every single thing except what you actually planted. It took me the better part of a lifetime and a great many aching afternoons out there on my knees to finally understand that I had never once needed to fight it at all. The ground was never my enemy. It was only ever asking me for the one thing I kept taking away from it: a blanket, something living to hold over itself. And the moment I quit scraping it bare and started keeping it covered, the fighting just quieted down. The garden began, slowly, season by season, to look after itself. And I found I could finally stand out at the edge of it in the evening, with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, and just watch it grow. The way my grandmother used to stand and watch hers. That is the kind of gardening the forest has been doing all along. The kind the old ones did, before any of us were ever taught that bare dirt and a full shopping cart were the modern way to grow. So if that is the kind of gardener you already are, or the kind you'd like to grow into, in the good seasons you still have ahead of you, then you belong right here, at this fence, with the rest of us. Subscribe, and let's keep tending the old, honest way. Together, cover the ground, keep the roots alive, feed the life below, and let the soil do the rest. It has been ready to, this whole time. It was only ever waiting on us to stop fighting it.